we need to increase our conventional deterrence. And I would also argue we need to relook at our nuclear deterrence, because that's in balance at the moment, and that's a bit of a concern. But yeah, I understand people are really concerned, and those people who are struggling to heat and feed themselves, this seems like a hell of a lot of money on something that's very far away. But actually, money spent on hard power now, because we have neglected our hard power, will actually, I think, save in the longer term.
NATO defence ministers are meeting in Brussels today, the agenda dominated by the efforts of NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte to get agreement on NATO allies raising defence spending to 3.5% of GDP, plus another 1.5% of GDP on defence-related infrastructure and resilience. The Americans are said to be firmly behind it, and the project even has a name: the Hague Investment Commitment. There's a NATO summit in The Hague later this month, and Rutte wants the commitment agreed by country leaders then. It's designed to replace NATO's 2014 commitment at a summit in Wales to increase defence spending to 2% of GDP, a target not all NATO allies have yet met. But where does this leave Britain, with a government that's still struggling to decide if it's really committed to 3% of GDP by 2034, never mind 3.5%. by 2032. Let's speak to Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, former commanding officer of NATO's Rapid Reaction Force. Colonel, thanks for joining us. First of all, how does this NATO process work? Does it have to be unanimous to agree 3.5%? And even if they do that way, is it in any way binding?
Well, I think probably the answer to both those questions is no. Although, having said that, I think the main thing that people need to understand is the peace dividend that we've all so well and truly spent, and even agreeing to 2% a few years ago, really doesn't cut the mustard. I don't often agree with much that's coming out of the White House at the moment, but I think the 5%, or rather the 3.5%, is absolutely bang on. I know people in this country, or the majority, probably don't really realise the real threats that we're facing at the moment, ostensibly from Russia. But actually, the only way to face down somebody like Putin is to show strength. He exploits weakness, but he respects strength. So I think 3.5% on defence and 5% in total, including the other elements like security that go with it, are bang on in this case.
Well, let's look at our own circumstance in the UK. Now, our government is going to increase defence spending from 2.3% to 2.5% of GDP, I think, by 2027. That's probably about as bankable as a promise as you can get from a politician. That will likely happen. But it's vague about moving to 3%. It's designating that as only an ambition, and before the next parliament is out. So even if it does it might not be till 2034. How can it credibly sign up to 3.5%?
Well, Andrew, I think you put your thumb absolutely on it. This is politicians speaking, who, of course, have more than a weather eye to the next general election. But they've just signed off and produced a defence review. And I think anybody who studied this in any detail, who realises the resources available, that strategic defence review, in my opinion, is actually a really good bit of work. I mean, there are a few bits missing, but there is no way you're going to get that defence review for 2.7% in 2 years' time, or 3% by 2034. If it's going to be funded in totality, it's going to be much more to 3.5%. I understand that the challenges that the politicians have got, but the stark reality is the threats overmatch the current deterrence that we have. And remember, when Putin looked west on the 24th of February 2022, he didn't see a credible conventional deterrence that would put him off, and that's why he invaded. And until we show him a credible conventional deterrence, nobody thinks he's going to stop at Ukraine.
Now, people always speak, and I've just done it, on percentages of GDP, which I think to many people, unless they're nerds like me, is kind of meaningless. So let me flesh this out a little bit and get your reaction. 2.5% of our current GDP is 70 billion. 3.5% is 100 billion. So even at just today's prices for the GDP, that's a £30 billion a year increase in defence. And of course, if and when we ever come to do it, it'll be more because of inflation, and the GDP will be bigger than it is now, we hope. Even that simple calculation, though, suggests that you cannot get that increase in defence spending without a tax increase.
Well, again, you're far more a financial expert than I am, but I do understand, this is a huge figure. And unfortunately, we have led our own destiny in effect towards it with, the rest of NATO. And as we so clearly now know that the backstop of NATO security, the US, is no longer reliable in this particular case.
That's the big change, isn't it? That's the big change.
Well, yeah, absolutely. We always assumed that Uncle Sam would come steaming over the Atlantic to save us. Now, that is clearly, well, certainly that's the indication the White House is giving. Whether actually when crash comes to bang, that's the case, we don't know. But we must plan on what we know at this moment. And we know at this moment that we need to increase our conventional deterrence. And I would also argue we need to relook at our nuclear deterrence, because that's in balance at the moment, and that's a bit of a concern. But yeah, I understand people are really concerned, and those people who are struggling to heat and feed themselves, this seems like a hell of a lot of money on something that's very far away. But actually, money spent on hard power now, because we have neglected our hard power, will actually, I think, save in the longer term. Because Sun Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher, said the art of warfare is to win without fighting.
Indeed.
The only way you can do that is by showing strength to a tyrant like Putin that he doesn't want to come up against.
Well, we spent 3% of our GDP on defence in 1937, when Nazi Germany was on manoeuvres. And that was clearly not enough, and we armed belatedly. By 1940, we were spending 52% of our GDP on defence. So you see what happens when it's late. I wonder if Europe doesn't need to increase its credibility when it comes to talking about our defence and how much it's going to spend. It took some NATO allies 11 years to hit the 2% of GDP target laid down in Wales 2014, 11 years ago. And some big countries in Europe haven't even managed that. Spain is only spending 1.3% of GDP on defence. Italy, 1.5%. So as Mark Rutte galvanizes and the Americans make pressure and a new German chancellor, the NATO allies in Europe really have to send out signals that they're serious and they're going to do this 3.5%. Otherwise, I would suggest, Colonel, it's not a deterrent.
Well, I think your point about the Second World War is really sanguine, and that's what people need to absorb. The fact that we had to spend 51%, 52% of GDP because we were at war, and in that particular metric, 3.5% or 5% seems like pretty good value. But absolutely, you're bang on. I mean, Spain and some of the other countries who should be leaning into this absolutely aren't. I'm slightly refreshed that the Germans belatedly, and yes. Frederick Merz, I understand, is with Trump today. I mean, the Germans have realized quite the position that they need to play. 200 billion euros on defense over the next 5 years is an extremely impressive figure. And we need people like the Germans to flex their military muscles, because they're far closer to this problem than we are. Go to Poland, they're spending 4.2%.
They are indeed. I'm planning to go to 5%.
Absolutely. The Baltic states, they realize that they are manning their trenches now, because they know that the Russian hordes, are about 5 minutes from actually attacking them as well. So across the piece, we need to be unified. I absolutely agree with you. And hopefully, even if it needs somebody like Hesketh to kick our particular bail here, hopefully it's enough to get everybody together to demonstrate, because deterrence is all about convincing your enemy that you are serious and again do things. And up until now, I'm sure Putin's looked out of the Kremlin and has not been concerned about Europe. He now needs to look out of the Kremlin and think, crikey, yeah, they're serious. Now is the time to negotiate a ceasefire.
I fear you're right about Mr. Putin, but as you say, Chancellor Merz of Germany, the new chancellor, he's meeting President Trump. He's already vowed that he's going to build the biggest conventional army in Europe now. Let's hope he spells that out to Mr. Trump in the Oval Office and makes it clear that things are changing. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you for joining us.